The year is 1274. Mongol cavalry commanders are training warriors for the invasion of Japan. They teach mounted archery, the feigned retreat, the standard step warfare doctrine that has conquered everything from Korea to Hungary. The warriors practice against each other. They master the approved techniques. They feel invincible. Then they land on Japanese beaches and discover that everything they learned works perfectly until it doesn't. The problem isn't their training. It's the terrain they're fighting on. Samurai don't fight on endless grasslands. They fight in rice paddies, bamboo forests, and mountain passes where horses sink to their shoulders in mud, where the perfected Mongol cavalry charge becomes a death sentence. This isn't accidental geography. This is an entire military culture that evolved to fight in conditions where Mongol advantages become liabilities. Doctrine refined through centuries of clan warfare on islands where mobility means something completely different than it does on the steppe. Mongol training taught warriors that speed was survival. Strike fast, retreat faster, never commit to static combat. This worked against opponents who fought the same way. Against samurai in terrain that swallowed horses, it got warriors killed. The fundamental difference was in mobility philosophy. Mongol doctrine emphasized the horse. The warrior and mount were a single weapon system. Speed, range, and the ability to disengage determined victory. You never fought where the enemy wanted. You forced them to fight where they were weak. Samurai training emphasized adaptability. Fight mounted when terrain allowed. Fight on foot when it didn't. The warrior was the weapon. The horse was useful equipment. Lose the horse, keep fighting. Lose the terrain advantage, create a new one. When Mongol cavalry thundered onto Japanese beaches with their composite bows and proven tactics, that confidence became confusion within hours. The beach landings started well enough. Mongols established beachheads, deployed their cavalry, began their standard operational doctrine. Then they moved inland, and the land itself became the enemy. Mongol horses were compact steppe ponies, tough and enduring on grassland. Japanese terrain was rice paddies that became impassable bogs, forests too dense for cavalry maneuver, mountain paths too narrow for formation riding. The horses that could gallop for days on hard steppes sank and struggled in wet soil. Japanese commanders recognized this and exploited it with deliberate precision. The terrain channeling was masterful. Samurai forces didn't meet Mongol cavalry in open battle. They drew them into valleys, forests, and flooded paddies where cavalry advantages evaporated, where the mounted archer became a slow-moving target for foot soldiers who trained specifically for this environment. Mongol doctrine required space to execute the feigned retreat, the signature tactic that had destroyed armies across Asia. Draw the enemy into pursuit, turn suddenly, and annihilate them with concentrated arrow fire. This required room to maneuver, to wheel formations, to maintain distance while shooting. Japanese terrain provided none of this. In narrow valleys, there was nowhere to retreat to. The feigned withdrawal led directly into dead ends, ambush points, or terrain too difficult for horses to navigate quickly. The tactic that had broken European heavy cavalry became a trap that Japanese forces exploited ruthlessly. Samurai warfare was built around individual combat skill, combined with tactical coordination. Warriors trained from childhood not just in mounted combat, but in fighting dismounted, in close quarters, in conditions where the horse was liability rather than asset. They carried multiple weapons, yumi bows for distance, naginata for reach, katana for close work, and could transition between them based on terrain and situation. Mongol warriors were specialists. Elite mounted archers, devastating in their element. Outside that element, their advantage collapsed. The close combat devastated Mongol forces. Mongol composite bows were superior to Japanese yumi in range and penetration. On the steppe, this mattered. In bamboo forests where combat happened at 20 paces, the longer Japanese bow could be drawn and released just as quickly, and the samurai wielding it had spent years training in precisely these conditions. The psychological impact was immediate. Mongol warriors expected enemies to break before their charge, to flee from their arrows, to be demoralized by the thunder of hooves and the reputation of invincibility. Japanese warriors didn't break. They stood in terrain where the charge couldn't reach them and fought with a calm intensity that Mongol doctrine hadn't prepared for. Fear is manageable when your tactical system provides responses. When your mobility advantage means you can disengage, regroup, choose engagement terms. When terrain traps you and opponents fight with techniques refined for exactly these conditions, fear compounds tactical disadvantage. The weather multiplied everything. The typhoons that destroyed Mongol fleets are famous. Less discussed is how Japanese forces used weather operationally. They knew storm patterns, knew when typhoons would likely strike, knew how to shelter in conditions that left Mongol cavalry exposed and vulnerable. They fought in rain that turned paths to rivers and made Mongol bowstrings useless, while Japanese warriors continued fighting with weapons designed for wet conditions. Mongol commanders tried to adapt. They dismounted cavalry, attempted to fight as infantry, reorganized formations for constricted terrain. This didn't work. The problem wasn't insufficient adaptation. The problem was that Mongol warriors had spent their entire lives training for steppe warfare. Their skill set, their instincts, their tactical judgment, all calibrated for conditions that didn't exist in Japan. Samurai had spent their entire lives training for exactly these conditions. Every mountain path, every rice paddy, every forest approach was familiar terrain. They knew which valleys flooded in rain, which beaches offered no cavalry maneuver room, which passes could be held by small forces against much larger armies. This wasn't home field advantage. This was systematic exploitation of environmental conditions by warriors whose entire combat system was designed around them. The Mongol composite bow could penetrate armor at 200 yards. Devastating capability. Meaningless when combat happened at 30 yards in bamboo thickets where the first sign of the enemy was steel emerging from foliage. Samurai closed distance with ruthless efficiency, negating range advantage, forcing combat into quarters where years of close combat training dominated. Mongol armor was scaled for mounted mobility protection balanced against weight and freedom of movement on horseback. Effective for cavalry warfare. Inadequate against samurai strikes with weapons specifically designed to defeat armor at close range. The naginata could hook and pull, the katana could find armor gaps, and the tanto could finish what the other weapon started. The night fighting was particularly brutal. Mongol doctrine emphasized daytime operations where visibility allowed coordination of cavalry units, where commanders could see the battlefield and adjust tactics. Samurai forces attacked at night, with warriors trained for low-visibility combat, using terrain familiarity to navigate while Mongol forces struggled in unfamiliar darkness. The supply situation accelerated the collapse. Mongol armies were logistics marvels on the steppe, but their supply system assumed mobility, assumed ability to forage effectively, assumed terrain that allowed rapid movement of supplies. Japanese terrain made supply lines vulnerable, made foraging difficult, and Japanese forces systematically targeted Mongol supply operations with raids that the cavalry couldn't prevent or pursue effectively. Mongol commanders wrote reports describing impossible fighting conditions, terrain that negated their tactical advantages, enemies who fought with techniques their training hadn't prepared for. They were describing a fundamental mismatch between combat system and operational environment. The Korean auxiliaries in Mongol forces noticed something the Mongol commanders initially didn't. Samurai weren't fighting random encounters. Every engagement reflected careful terrain selection, preparation, and tactical exploitation of conditions. This was systematic warfare optimized for the environment. Modern military historians analyzing the Mongol invasions of Japan note that Mongol operational planning assumed they could establish beachheads and then deploy cavalry in open battle. Japanese strategy never allowed those battles to happen. Every engagement was on terrain where cavalry advantages disappeared. When a military force changes tactics to avoid certain terrain types, they're admitting disadvantage in those environments. Mongol forces tried to avoid forests, narrow valleys, and wet paddies. But in Japan, that was nearly impossible. The technique gap wasn't bridgeable through courage or determination. Mongol warriors had both. What they didn't have was years of training in fighting dismounted on unstable ground against opponents whose entire martial system was built for precisely those conditions. That Mongol warrior landing on a Japanese beach with his composite bow and cavalry training thought he was prepared. He'd conquered Korea. He'd participated in victories across the empire. He'd mastered techniques that had defeated every enemy the Mongols faced. Then he rode inland and watched his horse sink in mud that Japanese warriors crossed easily on foot. Watched his arrows fail in rain, while samurai struck from ranges where his mobility advantage was useless. Found himself fighting dismounted against opponents who'd trained their entire lives for exactly this kind of combat, in terrain they knew intimately, under conditions his doctrine never anticipated. The fight lasted longer than seconds, but the outcome was equally certain. His training provided responses, but they all required mobility he didn't have, terrain that didn't exist, environmental conditions that weren't present. His courage didn't matter. His horse became liability. The techniques that had worked across Asia were designed for different ground. He learned that doctrine optimized for one environment becomes vulnerability in another. That training duration in wrong conditions doesn't overcome training in right conditions. That combat systems designed for specific terrain beat systems designed for different terrain, regardless of prior success. The Mongol military never conquered Japan. They attempted invasion twice, failed both times, not through lack of skill, courage, or tactical sophistication, but because their entire combat system was optimized for terrain that didn't exist on Japanese islands. That wasn't defeat. That was mismatch an army prepared for steppe warfare facing opponents optimized for island warfare, on ground that favored defenders completely. The lesson was clear. Tactical superiority is conditional. Combat effectiveness depends on environment. And when you face opponents who've spent generations perfecting warfare in terrain your system never anticipated, your victories elsewhere don't matter. That samurai holding a mountain pass against Mongol cavalry wasn't relying on courage or desperation. He was relying on terrain. Terrain his training used, his weapons suited, his tactics exploited. Terrain the Mongol facing him had never encountered and couldn't overcome despite superior mobility on different ground. The outcome was decided before the invasion began, not by fate, by preparation meeting environment, by combat system meeting operational reality, by warriors who fought where they were strongest against warriors whose strengths didn't translate. That wasn't a battle. That was a demonstration of what happens when doctrine meets geography, when cavalry meets mountains, when empire meets islands. The defenders won both times. And the Mongol military system never figured out how to change that outcome.